Foundation and co-sponsored by the Department of International Relations. Mercy is one of those words that crosses boundaries. As proclaimed by Pope Francis, it is a religious word, and in fact goes to the heart of what Christians and others mean by God's gratuitous action in our lives. But it is also a universal word that calls to each of us, both in that we've experienced something and benefited from it, and in that we each recognize something like a call to enact it. In this way, whether religious or not, mercy has a claim on our lives. But the word also crosses boundaries in that it calls not only for action, but for reflection. It finds its first home in action, granted, where we are granted mercy in our daily lives, or where we may show mercy to others. It's not as though, in other words, we're confronted with suffering and we immediately turn to reflection. By then, the moment has passed when we experience someone suffering, we act. We heard on Tuesday about the challenges faced by refugees, both in the current global crisis and throughout history in various ways. And through all of this, we are called to action. But we also heard about the complexities involved, and we recognize that the way forward is not easy. In this way, the call to mercy is also a call to reflection. If our acts of mercy are to be effective, they must be wise. And wisdom requires reflection that will allow us to think through how to engage in merciful acts, where that mercy is most beneficial, even to consider whether a blind injunction to mercy might in some cases be harmful rather than helpful. Finally, mercy crosses boundaries in a third way, in that it requires us to reflect not only on tragedy, on this particular tragedy, the refugee situation in this case, but also to take up different disciplinary lenses to look at the problem, each of which approaches the task from its own unique angle. These different lenses do not only provide different answers, but by asking different questions, they also testify to the multifaceted nature of the problem and call us to different but equally urgent forms of action. By inviting these thinkers and scholars here today from political science, theology, the church, we are acknowledging that we need to hear different voices on this issue, and that only through a cross-disciplinary dialogue can we begin to understand the issues at hand. Before we begin, let me say thanks once again to some of the people who made this possible. First, to our team at ACTI, including our director, Brian Traynor, and our senior administrative coordinator, Catherine Brown, and also to our intrepid brain students who made this event possible, John Mayfield and Rory O'Donnell. And I'd also like to thank International Relations again for sponsoring the event, for co-sponsoring this, and for making possible the photo images you see around the room here today. So if you get a chance, again, after the event concludes, take a look. And this panel up here actually has something about the photographer as well. One more thing, there's also a very interesting installation that is currently running that is sponsored by the Modern Languages and Literatures Department, and I believe it's in the Village. Is that right? It's taking place in the Village. Modern Language and Literatures Village in U-Haul that takes up a lot of the same themes that we've been dealing with on Tuesday and we'll take up again today. So please, if you have a chance, visit that installation. Okay, with that, I'll turn to introducing our speakers for the day. Professor Kirsten Fisk is a fellow at the World Policy Institute here at LMU and an assistant professor of political science. She teaches courses in comparative politics and international relations, including politics in Africa, dilemmas of humanitarian intervention, political violence and terrorism, and international security. Dr. Fisk's research focuses on issues of security, peace, and conflict, with emphases on forced migration in relation to violence and civil war dynamics, as well as on the strategic and normative implications of targeted killing via drones. She has published work in the Journal of Conflict Resolution, International Studies Perspectives, and Civil Wars, and has a co-edited volume with Jennifer Ramos entitled Preventive Force, Targeted Killing and Technology. She is currently working on a study that examines government, militia, and rebel violence against refugee communities in sub-Saharan Africa. Professor Jonathan Rothschild is Associate Professor of Theological Studies here at LMU. He received his PhD in Theological Ethics from the University of Chicago Divinity School. His work engages theological, ethical, and legal dimensions of current issues involving questions of justice, and his research has recently appeared in the Journal of the Society of Christian Ethics, the Journal of Religious Ethics, and the Journal of Law and Religion. He is the co-editor of Doing Justice to Mercy, Religion, Law, and Criminal Justice. In 2013, he co-directed an international forum here at LMU on restorative justice. Finally, Father Alan Figueroa Deck is rector of the LMU Jesuit community and distinguished scholar of pastoral theology and Latino studies in the Bellarmine College of Liberal Arts. He earned a couple of doctorates here, let's see. In Latin American Studies at St. Louis University and a doctorate in theology at the Gregorian University in Rome. Father Deck is the author and editor of 9 books and of many peer-reviewed and popular articles and chapters and books in the field of pastoral and Latino theology, spirituality, Catholic social teaching, and faith and culture. He is the co-founder and first president of the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians of the United States and a member of the Catholic Theological Society of America. He serves on the board of directors of the Jesuit School of Theology of Santa Clara University, Homeboy Industries, Verbum Dei High School, and the Center for Applied Research on the Apostolate at Georgetown University. This year saw the publication of Francis, Bishop of Rome, The Gospel for the Third Millennium, a theological study of the Latin American and Jesuit roots of Pope Francis. So once again, in terms of our itinerary, let's give them all a round of applause. Sorry. So in terms of our itinerary, we'll have our 3 speakers present first, and then we'll try to reserve about a half an hour for Q&A at the end. I realize we didn't get to the Q&A last time, so if you were here for that and you have these lingering questions that you'd like to ask, please bring them up today. I'd really like to hear from you. And that's it. So on that note, I will hand things over to Professor Kerstin.
I am going to talk with you today about what I consider a crisis of refugee protection. A lot of my research deals with the security issues that refugees face in their host countries. And so what I'll be talking about today mainly deals with that. So we think about the insecurity of refugees as they're leaving their countries, and less often I think about the insecurity of refugees once they arrive in a country of sanctuary, what is supposed to be a country of sanctuary. And that's what I focus on. So just to give you a brief overview of what I'll be covering, I want to talk about first just the key definitions. And do I need to step back? Is that better? Okay. Some key definitions. So who qualifies as a refugee? I'll give you some background in terms of the scope of the crisis. We can focus quite a bit on the Syrian refugee crisis, and for good reason, but I want to show you some statistics on really the severity and the scope of what is a global refugee crisis. I'll talk about some major protection challenges and focus more on my research of threats to refugees in that area. And then finally, I'll conclude with some policy implications in terms of how I think the international community can address some of the protection challenges that refugees face. So to begin with the definition, who qualifies as a refugee? So the definition of a refugee has been established in the 1951 UN Convention on the Status of Refugees, as well as in a 1967 additional protocol to that original international law. So according to the 1951 Convention, A refugee is a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his or her nationality and is unable to, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself or herself of the protection of that country or return there. The additional protocol was introduced in 1967, essentially took away any kind of geographical or temporal restrictions on who could qualify as a refugee, because the 1951 convention dealt with mainly the refugees from World War II, so mainly Jewish refugees, and so this was expanded to kind of recognize that refugees are coming from all over the world, different backgrounds, and different times. Okay, so we have in our legal definition of a refugee. The de facto definition of a refugee, just kind of a general definition of a refugee, is anyone who flees the country of origin or residence for fear of politically motivated harm. So in particular, when we think about refugees, we think about those who are fleeing civil war and fleeing direct persecution from their government, and so they fear returning to their country of origin. Okay, so in terms of the scale, the scope, the scale of the crisis, there are currently more than 16 million refugees under the UNHCR mandate throughout the world. There are additional more than 5 million refugees who don't fall under the UNHCR mandate because they're protected by UNRWA, which deals specifically with Palestinian refugees. Just to kind of give you an idea of how severe this has become recently, and you're probably aware from watching the news, there are about nearly 2 million newly displaced due to conflict or persecution in the year 2015. And just quickly, just to kind of give you a better idea of the scale, when the UNHCR was founded, the caseload was 2.1 million Europeans. So you think about kind of the original intention, the foundations of the UNHCR was meant to deal with about 2 million people, and today what the UNHCR is tasked with in terms of just how many refugees they are charged with protecting. So as you can see, there's been a pretty dramatic rise in the overall refugee population since 2011. By all indications, that's not going to abate anytime soon. It will be a crisis that is around and continues to grow by most estimates. Okay, so where are these refugees coming from? So I included a kind of just easy to read chart, hopefully, for those of you in the back. The major source countries for refugees with the end year of 2015. So you see very clearly Syria is generating the largest number of refugees, followed by Afghanistan, Somalia, South Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo. So this just goes to show kind of the scope of the crisis far beyond Syria, far beyond Syria. In terms of the major refugee hosting countries, you'll see right away that Turkey, Lebanon, Pakistan, and Iran stand out as being hosting some of the largest refugee populations in the world. But then also you see that many African countries are hosting very, very large refugee populations as well. And I say that because my research focuses on sub-Saharan Africa, which is home to millions of refugees. Another thing to keep in mind is that of all these people who are displaced around the world, fewer and fewer of them are able to actually return home. So if you look at the numbers in terms of refugees who are able to return to their countries of origin, you see that since 2011 there's been a steep drop and a kind of slight increase between 2014 and 2015. Okay, so hopefully this is all just a bit of context in terms of where we are and just the severity of the crisis that the world is facing. So, according to Antonio Guterres, who for Refugees in 2015, he says, "We are witnessing a paradigm change, an unchecked slide into an era in which the scale of global forced displacement, as well as the response required, is now clearly dwarfing anything we've seen before." So I think that sums it up pretty nicely. In terms of the major protection challenges, I'm fairly certain that the speakers who were here on Tuesday got into several of these. In particular, the funding shortfalls that the UNHCR faces, that it's only funding a very small percentage of its budget currently, and that problem is expected to continue. Another key kind of protection challenge is resettlement imbalance. So I'm sure that everybody's familiar with the debates going on in the United States in terms of political disputes and disagreements over the resettlement of refugees, where they should be resettled, and then how many of them is a key problem in terms of refugee protection. The one that I'll focus on, and I can come back to the other two if we have time in Q&A, I'll focus on what I consider to be a huge problem, which is rising anti-refugee sentiment and violence against refugee communities. Okay, so I hope you can see this in the back, but what I put up here, the chart on the left shows the percentage of Europeans who say that they are concerned that refugees will increase the risk of domestic terrorism in their countries. And you see that in many countries that are hosting or thinking about hosting refugees, large percentages of people say that they're worried about the risk of domestic terrorism resulting from refugees. The second chart on the right, it's asking how do people feel about the economic burden of the refugees, and are they a burden in terms of taking our jobs and our social benefits? And you see that large percentages of respondents in these cases also tend to fear that refugees will be affecting their day-to-day lives. So this is kind of part of a broader problem that's developing across Europe, which is direct acts of violence against refugee communities. Several of them have been in the news. You may have seen them in the news. In 2015, there were more than 1,000 arson attacks in Germany on refugee shelters, and that problem has continued into 2016. In Sweden, there's a problem with organized gangs that wear masks, patrolling the streets, especially in Stockholm, and they look for migrants and refugees and carry out attacks, beat them in the streets, essentially. And then in Turkey, government forces have been accused of and shown in videos actually attacking refugees as they try to cross the border into Turkey. And those are just a sampling of examples. Okay, so I focus on violence against refugee communities in sub-Saharan Africa. And throughout the years, I focused mainly on the year 2000 and later. Throughout the years, there have been African governments who have used their forces to directly attack refugee communities, killing refugees in the process and trying to displace them in many cases. So one clear example of that you see on the left is Lansana Conte, who's former president of Guinea. And he ordered his troops to carry out direct attacks on refugees. He actually incited violence of the entire Guinean community of Guinean nationals to go after the refugees. He said to drive them out of the country. The second example, and I see now kind of it's maybe too low for you to see, but Laurent Gbagbo in the Ivory Coast is another president who's been accused of ordering his forces to carry out direct attacks on refugees and other foreigners living in his country. The severity of attacks in the Ivory Coast really was worst between 2002 and 2004. And then a more modern example, a more recent example, is taking place in Burundi, where the Burundian government has effectively, the leader, the president, Nkurunziza, has called for a third term. He wants to amend the constitution serve a third term in the presidency, and there have been massive protests against that. And he's begun to severely repress the protests and carry out attacks on individuals in Burundi. And as these individuals flee to other countries, Tanzania, Kenya, Rwanda, the DRC, he's having his forces actually pursue them into what should be countries of sanctuary. And so there are articles that these refugees are actually being hunted down. And there's plenty of evidence to suggest that that's the case. Okay, so in just a few minutes I have remaining, I wanted to share some of my research with you. I do carry out case studies of different incidents of violence against refugees, but I also look at kind of a large quantitative scale in terms of attacks on refugees. So in one of my more recent pieces, my research question is, do refugee-populated areas experience higher rates of violence against civilians compared to other locations in a host country? And I look at 29 different countries during the period 2000 to 2010. And my dependent variable, the outcome I'm trying to understand, is one-sided violence against civilians, which is essentially direct and intentional attacks by organized armed forces on civilian populations. That includes violence perpetrated by military forces, paramilitary forces, police, government-funded and run militias, and drug groups. So I look at the total number of refugees in a given province in these 29 different countries in Africa. And I find that areas within these countries that are home to larger numbers of refugees experience a significantly higher rate of attacks on civilians compared to other locations in the host country. So I look at who's attacking the refugees. Is it the sending country? Is it the host country? And it turns out that it's actually both in many cases. So in terms of sending country attacks on refugees, they've increased by about 16% where refugees are located. In terms of host country attacks on civilians, they increased by about 5% where there are larger refugee populations compared to other places in the host country. Okay, so rather than end on a really depressing note, I like to point to kind of this what can be done, or what are some potential solutions for these problems that refugees are facing. One major claim that I make is that the UNHCR really needs to do more to engage with the more political aspects of refugee protection. In many cases, that entails calling out these host governments who are perpetrating attacks on refugees and holding them accountable, holding the leaders accountable for directing the attacks or allowing the attacks to happen in many cases. So in addition to that, I argue that there needs to be efforts to improve the monitoring, investigating, and reporting of violence against refugees. The international community needs to work to counter public misconceptions and misinformation about refugees, as well as the xenophobic propaganda that often accompanies attacks on refugees. I argue that the international community needs to increase international awareness of the plight of refugees, exactly where they came from and why, and the type of suffering that they face. And then finally, not finally, but in addition, I argue that these governments need to name and shame politicians who engage in xenophobic rhetoric. So that's it for me. I'll just close with an empty quote. Thank you.
It's an honor to be up here with my colleagues, and I want to start with a word of thanks to both James and Kat and John and Lori and all members of ACTI for the invitation. I'd also like to do a little shout out to my honors course that's here in attendance. We've been talking about immigration in my course, and I've learned a lot from them. They've also learned that I can be long-winded, so I'm going to read my paper so that it's closer to 15 minutes, so you can ask them about that later. My brief reflections will be modest, not the least of which because the crisis involving refugees and displaced persons involves incredibly complex theoretical and practical issues. At best, my thoughts might serve as a footnote to the poignant narratives provided by the practitioners on Tuesday. I am aware of my own social location and privilege as I try to marshal resources within law, theology, and political theory to sketch out what I take to be the central challenges and the prospects for mercy in addressing the obligations to refugees and displaced persons. In 2014, the number of people displaced by war, intrastate strife, and human rights violations had reached 59.5 million, as part of a wider population of an estimated 200 million people seeking livelihood and refuge away from the land of their birth. Of these people, 14.4 million in 2014 and 16.1 in 2015 were determined to be refugees under the UN Human Rights Commissioner's mandate. Who is a refugee? We heard, but just bear with me. According to the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees and its 1967 protocol, which has now been ratified by 148 nations, a refugee is someone who has fled his or her country owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. The Convention's provisions are rooted in three fundamental protections for refugees: non-discrimination, non-penalization, and non-refoulement. The third principle, which is stated in Article 33, holds without exception that no one shall expel or return a refugee against his or her will, in any manner whatsoever, to a territory where he or she fears threats to life or freedom. This provision has now become embedded in customary international law. I do share a concern, however, emerging among scholars that forced migrants or displaced persons impacted by extreme poverty, violence, or environmental issues such as desertification should also receive the same protections called for by the Refugee Convention. The rule of law needs to support human rights, not become the basis for denying them. As legal theorist Catherine Deverneau observes, quote, "The power of the law is implicated in the failure of human rights norms to reach those who are most marginalized because of the tyranny of jurisdiction," end quote. This tyranny of jurisdiction has not only resulted in political actors abandoning some of the most vulnerable populations, but it has also failed to protect displaced persons from capricious exercises of power, e.g. arbitrary detention, and structural oppression, e.g. discrimination and sexual and gender-based violence. Laws cannot become ossified or indifferent to the changing circumstances of refugee populations. In the same way that the United States is finally beginning to reform its juvenile justice policies, international refugee laws need to be flexible in design and implementation, given that it's estimated that over half of all refugees are under the age of 18. Another key question: who holds the obligations to protect and assist refugees and displaced persons? It is evident that the Westphalian model of state sovereignty continues to decline, and the refugee crisis creates unique challenges for sovereignty. Political philosopher Giorgio Agamben writes, quote, "By breaking the continuity between man and citizen, nativity and nationality, refugees put the originary fiction of modern sovereignty in crisis," end quote. Kantian aspirations of perpetual peace have been shattered by waves of refugees from World War I onward. Nevertheless, states still continue to bear primary responsibilities, as evidenced by a December 2015 resolution on refugees adopted by the UN General Assembly. One of the challenges is that developing countries host 86% of the world's refugees, and the very poorest countries among them provide asylum to the 25% of the world total. Such commitments have hindered these countries' ability to develop their own political and economic structures. whereas wealthy nations have attempted to circumvent their obligations under the Convention under the auspices of sovereignty. For example, this past Sunday, Australia, one of the original signatories of the 1951 Convention, announced a planned policy to ban any asylum seeker who attempts to reach its shore by boat from ever visiting the country. According to Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, thousands of asylum seekers who have returned to their homelands in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia would be banned for life from ever traveling to Australia as tourists, to do business, or even as the spouse of an Australian. Though we heard on Tuesday positive developments in the reception of refugees within an American and California context, it is important to acknowledge factors that have contributed to forms of American exceptionalism, whereby sovereignty and national interest override obligation to refugees. In the 1993 case of Sale versus Haitian Centers Council Incorporated, the United States Supreme Court ruled that the Coast Guard could intercept vessels illegally transporting passengers from Haiti to the United States without first determining whether they may qualify as refugees. The court found that such actions, deemed necessary to protect U.S. borders, did not violate the Refugee Convention, based in part on the court's interpretation of the French refugee return according to the Convention, but according to the court, defined as repel or expel. Expelling Haitians before they reach the U.S. border also avoided violating Article 32 of the Convention, which states, quote, "The contracting states shall not expel a refugee lawfully in their territory on grounds of national security or public order," end quote. At one point, the court even acknowledges that its interpretation, quote, "may even violate the spirit of Article 33. But a treaty cannot impose uncontemplated extraterritorial obligations on those who ratify it," end quote. The United States, to be sure, can defend its territorial integrity, but those forms of jurisprudential judgments, tantamount again to a tyranny of jurisdiction, cannot obviate political, legal, and moral duties to those who face persecution and extreme suffering should they return to their home. In developing criteria for evaluating the duties of states to refugees and displaced persons, we can consider several factors. One is proximity, which enhances responsibility. In the case of the nearly 5 million Syrian refugees, 95% are now hosted in the neighboring countries of Turkey, Lebanon, and Iran. Other countries, however, in the region, such as the United States, Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait, have offered 0 resettlement places to Syrian refugees. Yet it is overly simplistic and politically and economically infeasible to assume that neighboring countries should always disproportionately host the refugees and displaced persons of a neighboring state. Another factor, therefore, pertains to the economic resources, infrastructure, and political stability of states. Germany, for example, has pledged to take in over 1 million refugees and currently has sponsored 54% of the EU total for Syrian refugees. On the other hand, high-income countries such as Japan, Singapore, and South Korea have offered 0 resettlement places for Syrians. Though I critique aspects of American policies and legal interpretations regarding refugees above, it should be noted that the economically capable United States resettled 73,000 refugees during 2014, or 70% of the world's total. A third criterion for state intervention addresses the history between nations. As theological ethicist David Hollenbach argues, quote, "European powers that benefited from colonizing regions of Africa or Asia without contributing to their development have significant duties to be open to refugees and other migrants from those regions," end quote. Adhering to this post-colonial critique would mean that the United States would have special duties toward refugees, for example, from countries such as Iraq, Vietnam, and Guatemala. Some have identified this type of responsibility as consistent with a use post bello that expands traditional just war criteria and duties. Finally, states' obligations to refugees and displaced persons require international cooperation, which has been encouraged by Catholic social teaching and Vatican II documents such as Pope John XXIII's Pacem in Terris. Attention to these legal and political structures are critically important, but analysis of refugees and displaced persons must also consider the deeply human aspects. Political philosopher Hannah Arendt assesses those aspects in this way. quote, "The calamity of the rightless is not that they are deprived of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or of equality before the law and freedom of opinion, formulas which were designed to solve problems within given communities, but that they do not belong to any community whatsoever." End quote. This dislocation, often the result of an accident of birth, throws the refugee into contested spaces where he or she always remains the outsider. The biblical example of the Good Samaritan sheds light on the obligations that we owe to the outsider. Catholic theologian M. Sean Copeland reframes the parable in terms of a contemporary example. A Somali woman who gives birth unassisted beside a road in southern Italy amidst a jeering crowd. According to Copeland, quote, "This story captures graphically in our contemporary world what it means to be exploited, despised, poor woman of color, to be vulnerable and visible, to suffer and endure shame, to live with little or no regard and consolation, to be a spectacle." End quote. Copeland's insight is that the refugee is often not ignored, but rather recognized and ridiculed for his or her otherness that engenders and empowers feelings of hostility, exclusion, and superiority. This us versus them mentality socially constructs the otherness of the refugee, which leads to ghettoization, social discontent, connectedness, and economic and political disenfranchisement. The refugee, in other words, is still deprived of belonging to a community. An equally problematic phenomenon occurs when forced assimilation and deprivation of connections to traditional language and customs are imposed upon refugee communities. How can we then welcome refugees as members of our community? Mercy can be instructive here. Above, I castigated aspects of the rule of law that have dehumanized and denied basic rights to refugees. Mercy as attention to concrete individuals, context, and particular needs can resist overly procedural, politically interested interpretations of the law. However, practices of mercy can also promote transformed social relations. Reflecting also on the Good Samaritan parable, Protestant theologian Matthew Meyer Bolton describes mercy, quote, "as the practice of transgressive care, the humane and humanizing work of repair and reconciliation in human life, where merciful acts are acts of reconstituting social arrangements and social life, of trespassing conventional lines between insiders and outsiders by helping to usher outsiders in, and so of unsettling customary practices of privileges and dispensation." End quote. Mercy unsettles, reconfigures, and reconciles by resisting structures of power predicated on difference and legal designations. To be sure, we need to be vigilant against appropriations of religion that reinforce separation, conflict, and violence. Anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim hate crimes and hate speech in the United States have reached their highest levels since just after September 11, 2001. 3 white militia members in western Kansas who called themselves the Crusaders were recently charged by federal prosecutors for planning to bomb the apartments and makeshift mosques for Somali residents living in Craig in western Kansas. Austria's Protestant Church last month criticized the anti-immigrant Freedom Party's presidential hopeful after he used the phrase, "so help me God," on his campaign posters. As theological ethicist Esther Reed cautions, quote, "The Bible has authorized nationalism and sanctified all manners of violence and the cutting and recutting of identities." End quote. We could point to a myriad of other ways in which religious discourse and symbols deconstruct, divide, and damage individuals and communities. Despite these legitimate concerns, religiously informed senses of mercy can contribute to ongoing discussions about obligations toward refugee and displaced persons. Rather than falling into the convenient and enchanting narratives of public safety and order, which in reality are constituted by moral panic and a climate of fear, mercy requires us to hear the cries and to respond to the neighbors in need. As Cardinal Walter Casper writes, again in reference to the Good Samaritan, quote, "Jesus tells this parable as a response to the question, who then is my neighbor? His answer is, not someone at a distance, but rather the one for whom you become the neighbor, the one whom you tangibly encounter, and who needs your help in a particular situation." End quote. As a presupposition of and precondition for justice, mercy invites us to reimagine the ways in which we understand God, ourselves, others, and the world in ways that can integrate relationality, compassion, and suffering. Through God's mercy, as Walter Casper suggests, quote, God allows God's self in sovereign freedom to be affected by pain and suffering. End quote. Pope Francis similarly views Jesus Christ as the face of God's mercy. Kenyan Jesuit A.E. Orator extends this idea of a relational, responsive, and suffering God further, holding that, quote, God has pitched a tent with the refugees. The theological rapprochement suggested this imagery of a displaced, mobile, or migrant God reinforces the ethical imperatives of hospitality, refuge, finding home, and protection for the displaced and migrant peoples. End quote. The practical import of mercy is not limited to the one who receives mercy. While refugees may benefit from the corporal works of mercy, such as feeding the hungry, sheltering the homeless, and clothing the naked, our social, political, and legal structures and communities would benefit from the spiritual works of mercy, such as instructing the ignorant, counseling the doubtful, and admonishing the sinner. To develop further obligations to refugees and displaced persons, we need to support frameworks of international law such as the UN Convention on Refugees, and to pursue persistent, compliant, and just enforcement, not convenient or principally self-interested exceptionalism. The radically changing geopolitical structure still necessitates state intervention, even as we envision new collaborative possibilities in the face of burgeoning numbers of refugees and displaced persons. At the level of communities and interpersonal encounters, we need to confront our own implicit biases, cultures of fear, and resistance to hospitality. Rather than juxtaposing maintaining public order on the one hand and welcoming refugees on the other as somehow incompatible, we should see these as mutually dynamic ways to build our communities and neighborhoods. Mercy invites us to respect the dignity of the other, but also to see the other as other, and yet also connected to us in profound ways through solidarity and shared destiny. As economist and philosopher Marty Ascend notes, quote, there are few non-neighbors left in the world today. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. And first, I want to congratulate the Academy of Catholic Thought and Imagination for putting together this wonderful program. I'm very honored to be here with my colleagues, and I'm happy to be able to continue our reflection on what we've been learning. My focus is going to be primarily on what theology, at least some aspect of theology, affords, what it contributes to getting into the subject and reflecting a little bit more deeply about it. And not just Catholic theology, but the reality of the reflection and the convictions of various religions that we are familiar with on this matter, and some of the implications about what it means in terms of what we do about the challenge of the displacement of people. The Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are incredibly rich in allusions to the role of displacement in the human experience. The word displacement evokes in these faiths the deepest and most enduring understanding of the God who, in the very foundations of the Abrahamic religions, millennia ago, became known as the one who called Abraham to leave his native land and to become a displaced person, an alien, a sojourner in search of the promised land. In the solemn prayer of the Catholic faith, in the Eucharist or the Mass, Abraham is referred to as our father in faith. To Abraham, we can add many other biblical figures. I would mention Joseph, Jacob's son, as well as Moses, and the first Hebrews, whose faith in a God of justice and love took shape precisely in the Exodus story, in the context of their flight from slavery in Egypt. And of course, we can also add the last and the greatest of the prophets, Jesus Christ himself, who, as an infant, became a refugee in Egypt, along with his parents, Mary and Joseph. Nor should we forget the prophet Muhammad, who himself, in his historic flight to Medina, became a refugee in what is called the Hijra, commemorated as the first day of the Muslim calendar. Here at LMU, named in honor of Ignatius of Loyola, I can also recall, in connection with our topic, that St. Ignatius' favorite term for himself was the pilgrim. And he saw his order of priests and brothers as available and ready to move wherever the worldwide church needed them to, yes, become displaced. He proposed for all Jesuits openness to this displacement, just like the God of Jesus Christ did, who, in a way of speaking, is the first and the foremost of all displaced beings, Jesus himself. For the God of Christianity is an incarnate God, who, as St. Paul tells us, quote, did not deem equality with God as something to be grasped, but emptied himself and taking the form of a slave. So in my words this morning, or this afternoon, I want to remind us about the richness and the pertinence of our faith traditions, specifically on the matter that we're dealing with, the movement of people, whether as refugees or immigrants, across international borders in search of survival and a better and more secure life. We know that this movement has today, as has been demonstrated so clearly, has reached its highest levels in human history and is an unmistakable sign of the times that we live in. It's appealing to our individual and our collective consciences day after day with relentless urgency. I believe that for many of us, the response to the pressing reality of the displacement of peoples throughout the world, including on our U.S. borders, can and should be informed not only by moral, ethical, and humanitarian concerns that torment our consciences, but all of this can and, in my view, should be informed by faith. This is especially true at Loyola Marymount University, where the promotion of faith and the service of justice are seen as integral reality, as connected, as complementary stances toward the reality of injustice in all its forms. Looking at the issue of the displacement of people from the perspective of faith might be just as pertinent for us today, for these challenges, as it was for Dr. Martin Luther King, for his pursuit of civil and human rights for African Americans, or for the struggle of Cesar Chavez a few decades ago for Latino and Filipino migrant workers. Pope Francis, perhaps more than any other world leader, is reminding us of the connection between faith and action in pursuit of justice by integrating faith in an all-loving creator, integrating that with respect for every part of that creator's creation. Francis points out that the response to the horrendous dangers of ecological degradation of the human family cannot be based upon just on what the sciences tell us. Cannot just be based on our dispassionate intellectualizing about it. But it must also include passion and compassion that finds its basis in faith, in a transcendent order of things that perpetually is calling forth from humanity a greater, an ever greater capacity to give of itself, to encounter and to engage with others in greater solidarity and ever-increasing dialogue. Yet I hasten to add that in the current worldwide debate about migration and refugees, the message of Catholic social teaching is solidly based on faith, but also on reason. Pope Francis recently reminded us in an airplane interview on his return from Sweden that the enemy of finding a real, practical response to this crisis, not the crisis of the displacement of people, the crisis of refugees, the main obstacle to that is fear. And yet, at the same time, the best friend or the best help, the best advisor for us in this situation is prudence, is wisdom. The solution is found not only in opening one's heart to those in need, but also pursuing the path of the integration of cultures and knowledge about how that can happen. What do we know? What have we learned about intercultural affairs? How competent are we in these matters? It would be a terrible loss for the United States, for instance, if our shadow side as Americans, the xenophobia that we have seen in this year's presidential election, if that means that racism, the terrible history of racism in our country against Native peoples and against African Americans, for example, if that is to prevail. We have another side, the other current of our history, which is the legacy of the integration of cultures and races that, despite our many imperfections here in the United States, we have tried to pursue throughout our history. This is a golden thread, a legacy that allows us to integrate not only people of European backgrounds, but also immigrants from every race and every culture. The hard work of integration requires more than ever intercultural competencies and a deepening awareness of implicit biases that work against the mutual understanding and the dialogue that the successful reception of the other, whoever the other might be, migrants and refugees, for instance, the reception that requires. Pope Francis powerfully exemplified this golden thread in our history in the four narratives of great Americans that he highlighted in his historic speech before the U.S. Congress just a few months ago. Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, Dorothy Day, and Thomas Merton, who were all people profoundly motivated to transformative action in pursuit of justice, were given as models of this kind of seeking for the integration of peoples. For Jews, for Christians and Muslims, it is the God of Abraham who, in Revelation and over time, continues to incarnate that in himself, and call forth this justice and this love in the form of mercy. I do not think I'm stretching it too far to say that for Christians, Muslims, and Jews, mercy is the highest form of justice. And concern for public policy and for politics in its most noble sense is the highest form of love. or the highest form of charity. For the past several centuries, the culture of modernity, our modern, postmodern culture, has promoted the compartmentalization of knowledge and furthered the notion that theology and politics do not go together. Yet, interestingly enough, Pope Francis's actions and words are forging a renewed awareness of how important faith in a transcendent order of reality, how important that is in nourishing both the mind and the imagination of people in the pursuit of the transformation, of the changes, of the differences that need to occur in our society and in our cultures. In the past 40 years, I have noticed a growth in maturity among theologians and social ethicists who study migration and refugees. This is an enormous challenge embedded in the socioeconomic, religious, and cultural structures of humanity. It is not enough to view it as a matter of personal or individual morality or individual choice. The Catholic Church has led the way in insisting on the reality of what is called structural sin, evil that is the product of deeply embedded patterns of thinking and inequality and injustices across the globe that must be confronted by transformative political engagement. Pope Francis' stunning reflection in Laudato Si on the need for care of our common home, care of the ecology, is an example of this, as is the Pope's insistent advocacy for migrants and for refugees. The challenge faced by today's world, by the massive movement of people, requires study, as we're doing here, solid knowledge, careful analysis, but also imagination and really, more than anything else, motivation that draw deeply from the well of human compassion and spirituality. People and nations must be free from oppression, yes, but also free for pursuing the common good. That is, to pursue their altruistic selves, not their self-interests alone. It seems to me that nothing less than this will provide the human family with the magnanimity and the sacrificial love, agape, as the Greeks called it, necessary to face the enormous toll of other things that move us and that motivate us. Things like old and tired conceptions of sovereignty, of nationalisms, of xenophobia, implicit biases, territoriality, racism, and egotism. Things that we know are real and that affect each one of us. Thank you.
Several of them work for public agencies. So that might be a place of public agencies set up to coordinate bringing refugees in, resettling them. There's also nonprofits that focus perhaps on sort of particular aspects. So sometimes CAS, for example, focuses more on trafficking issues. So they might be a particular, they're focused on issues related to displaced persons or refugees, but they sort of look at specific aspects of particular needs or particular experiences of refugees. So I think sort of maybe trying to look at both public agencies, governmental agencies, and nonprofits might be a way to try to get involved. And also churches, religious organizations sometimes sponsor particular families, refugee families, or have a relationship with communities. The wonderful thing about Los Angeles, of course, is the great variety and diversity of communities, and they are likely to attend to particular religious refugee communities.
Along those lines, I would just add that, Professor Rothschild mentioned that about 70,000 refugees are received in the United States every year. And it's not generally known, but about a third of them are settled under Catholic auspices, mainly by dioceses throughout the world in the context of organizations like Catholic Charities. So here in LA, we're in Southern California, Catholic groups are always, and Lutheran services also is very active in these things. So if you just look around, especially public agencies, you'll find it.
Also, I would say you can email us at acti@lmu.edu, ACTI. We can get you the contact information for some of the speakers on Tuesday if you are working with organizations in the area.
My question to Ms. Fisk. In your presentation, you had a chart that said Afghanistan has the second most refugees behind Syria. According to a Pew Research study, which is the same research company that you used in your presentation, 99% of Afghans believe in Sharia law, which condones death as punishment for homosexuality and it disrespects women. Would you want someone with such strong and oppressive views towards women and to believe that someone should be put to death for sexuality living next door to you and your family?
Yes. I think that, it's commonly cited dispute about the religion of particular refugees, that they should be discriminated against in many ways in terms of who is allowed to come in and who isn't. And I think that that's an incredibly slippery slope. I think that once you start making distinctions like the one you just mentioned, it paves the way for a whole host of potential arguments against why we shouldn't be bringing refugees in. Long story short. And I don't know if you wanted to address that question to anyone else or just me.
No, that's good. I'll ask another question too.
Okay.
Hi, I want to thank everybody in the panel here for great presentations, and I absolutely agree with you. I think that faith and politics definitely go hand in hand, especially because so many people use their faith to think about their policy stances at times. And so with that in mind, I'm really interested about this question about mercy as a discussion for the refugee conversation. And I guess I'll open this up to anybody in the panel who wants to answer it. But how do you guys explain, or how can we explain, and this question may be not as clear because there's so many components that I'm thinking about, but how can we explain how people can use their religion to have such xenophobic understanding of situations, right? And not use concepts like mercy to really ground an understanding of like systemic world issues that individuals aren't necessarily responsible for, but that they are targeted as others, right? And so that how in the U.S. and around the world, but particularly in the U.S. because we immigration issues. We have refugee issues with Central American children, not just the Syrian refugees or Muslims, right? But how can people really ground their ignorance, racism, xenophobia, however we want to explain it, on their religion?
This is not a new phenomenon to some extent. This is the history of the world. We have found ways, and we might sort of in the more recent discourse identify as identity politics. So we identify ourselves with certain features, beliefs, characteristics, and we see that as a divisive kind of thing. If you don't share my beliefs, then you somehow are different from me, and I'm going to oppose you because I want to sort of uphold the truth of my own convictions. And I think it's similar to what Professor Fisk was just mentioning, the sort of dangers of doing that, of reducing others simply to one feature of who they are, what they do. I mentioned Amartya Sen. He also, in another place, talks about what he calls the miniaturization of people. That is, we are a plurality of selves, but we often engage others simply as one feature of who they are, like their religion, or their race, or their class, or something to that effect. So we identify ourselves in certain ways, and we see others as either representing that or not representing that, and it becomes sort of the basis for discrimination. It's a very complex issue. We, as I try to briefly mention in my paper, we want to be very mindful of the ways in which religion and political views can be co-opted, can be appropriated in ways that are destructive. And we certainly can't be naive to assume that there'll be peaceful coexistence. But if we really, I think, want to take seriously the mandate of both justice and mercy, we need to be very mindful of the way in which these sort of identity politics play out in very destructive ways.
I also think that in terms of the question that was asked about the Afghan refugees, that Pope Francis does give kind of a hint of how we might respond to that concern. When he says that fear is the big enemy of finding a way to respond to the reality of refugees. But the big friend, our friend in this whole matter, is prudence. And we have to ask ourselves what he means by that. I think he's referring to the fact that even in the example that you give, we're not going to simply, let any and everybody come in different countries, and I'm not talking about our country, any country that would have to consider receiving a refugee that has some ideas that seem to be antisocial, you could say, or antisocial ideas. In other words, no one is proposing that there not be some order, some regulation, some inspection, some analysis of who these people are and what they might do. Nobody is saying that, So I think that's the main thing, and to use those particular examples to discriminate against one group of people. In human history, we've seen over and over again that this can become really just a kind of a cop-out and not really a way to respond. So that's how I would answer.
The father of the Orlando shooter, he was a Afghan immigrant. And our government, the Orlando shooter, the guy that shot the 49 homosexuals that were brutally murdered in a nightclub in Orlando. His father was an Afghan immigrant, and our government let him in, so I don't know if I trust that process. I have another question.
Let's let them answer that one. And then I think we need to go to somebody else who might have.
Okay.
Because we have about 10 minutes, so we just need to answer that question as well. Okay?
I think you're raising an instance that was a very tragic situation, and what can we do to prevent such things? I think everybody is interested in that. I think the challenge is, how do you develop policies and principles that are not sort of informed by singular examples? In the same way, I think that there's debates about voter integrity and voter fraud discussed. How do we sort of recognize that we can eliminate every possibility, including very destructive ones, but to let sort of, again, what hopefully are outlier examples be the basis for developing our principles and policies, I think is difficult and potentially does more harm, even if we have good intentions of safeguarding public order and safety. So we always have to be aware of sort of the matrices of concerns that would include the possibility that people will do destructive actions. But to let a few examples become the basis for our policies, I think is misguided.
Let's follow up. Sure. But it's not just like an example here or there. Like for example, in the UK and like in England and Wales, 900 Syrians were arrested over the course of a year for crimes such as rape and child abuse. So it's not just like a singular case. But my question would be, do you think it's worth the risk of the host country if 900 people are being affected? Like that 900 of those tribes are being affected. Like people are being like rapes going on and stuff. Do you think it's worth the risk of the host country to let people in and risk that happening to them, for that to happen to their loved ones?
Again, I think you're pointing to statistics that are unsettling. It's very unfortunate. I think one of the things we would do with any statistic is probe down. So how do we, looking at a sort of certain population who might have seemingly higher rates of committing these kinds of crimes than other populations, what is the host country doing to try to integrate those populations? And it's not to say that it's solely the responsibility of the host country and to disavow the importance of individual responsibility. But I think that there are complex variables. One of the things that I sort of mentioned is how do we welcome refugees into our communities? Is it the case, as the 1951 convention, are there attempts to integrate economically, to provide ways where politically and culturally immigrant communities become part? I think the statistics would bear out that those communities that feel more connections, more integration within the host community, those crimes will be low. So I think it's, again, you're raising a fair point. It's not to explain it away, but I think it's looking at a broader spectrum of variables to evaluate all the factors that might be contributing to those kinds of crimes.
I think it's interesting that Pope Francis just 2 days ago, when he was coming back from Sweden, was asked on the airplane specifically about the fact that Sweden has had a very good track record in a lot of ways with treatment and the acceptance of refugees. But the Pope went on to say that what's really been important about Sweden's response to the urgency of refugees, the needs of refugees, was that Sweden had in place a program to integrate. So I follow what Professor Rothschild was saying, that it had a program to integrate people. That, in other words, that to just isolate an instance, and particularly not to understand whether or not there were other factors in place, really doesn't shed a lot of light on what we should do by way of policy. But if we know that the relationship between accepting refugees and having a real program whereby the local society can relate to these newcomers, and these newcomers can relate to them, it's very smart, very intelligent, because if you don't do that, we know what can happen. You know, fear will overtake and people will get violent, either on one side or the other, or on both. And so you have that kind of a result. So I think that it speaks to the issue that the answer to these matters require a lot of prudence, a lot of wisdom, a lot of analysis, and you cannot remain just at the level of these isolated data and draw general conclusions from them, because that's not very helpful.
Well, thank you all for your questions, and please join me in thanking all of our speakers.